Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The Dog-Eared God by Frank Belknap Long. Weird Tales, November 1926. The Egyptians' gods are shaped like beasts, but why they represent them in this way I had rather not mention. Herodotus. "What do you think of it?" asked Professor Dewey. The colossal height of the mummy case accentuated my friend's littleness. Somehow, I don't know why the image should have presented itself. I thought of the opium-haunted De Quincey, walking wearily about the streets of London, a grotesque little midget in carpet slippers who carried a world within his head. Professor Dewey bore an amazing resemblance to De Quincey. His forehead was high and shrunken and covered with wrinkles, and the skin on his lean cheeks was stretched as taut as yellow parchment. His nose could scarcely be described as Roman. It was so excessively Hebraic that a strain of Jewish blood unquestionably formed a measure of his heritage. His smile, when he did smile, was grim and lifeless, and very few people would have been attracted to him. But beneath his almost repulsive exterior, the little chap had a good heart, and I found his companionship delightfully stimulating. Professor Dewey's hobby was Egyptology, and he imported large quantities of mummies annually, and I am sorry to add, illegally. No prying customs officer ever laid his sternly official hand on one of Professor Dewey's acquisitions. No blue-eyed and impertinent government clerk ever questioned Professor Dewey as to the value of his queer and often repulsive property. The professor had made arrangements with a dozen sly and secretive skippers, whose Levantine dealings were seldom above reproach. And as a result of his careful bargaining, he never lost a mummy or scarab or precious stone. In the course of a single year, 83 mummies had been successfully smuggled into his stately brownstone mansion on Riverside Drive. We stood in Professor Dewey's mummy room, a great hall carpeted with red velvet and lined with rather sinister black curtains. It seemed ridiculous to me that the professor should furnish this repository with the trappings of occult melodrama, but I have always been singularly incapable of fathoming my friend's amusing whims. Beneath his whimsicality and eccentricity, he was reasonably genuine, and it is unfair to expect common sense or restraint from a man of genius. The mummy before us was unusually tall. It fairly towered in the yellowish gloom of the great room, and it bore unmistakable characteristics of great age. And it was oddly shaped. Its breast swelled out curiously and its nose was gigantic. Indeed, the latter member almost protruded through the aromatic and evil-smelling wrappings. "An Egyptian Cyrano," I remarked, and permitted a grin to disturb my usually severe and solemn features. The professor often assured me that my features were severe, and being a very young man, I took pardonable pride in the fact. "How the ladies must have hated him," I added, seeing my friend scowl. "This is a serious matter," he said after a pause that seemed interminable. "Nothing like this has ever come out of Egypt." "I do not like it." My friend's voice was distressingly hollow. It made me nervous, and I endeavored to quiet him. "There is nothing very unusual about this mummy," I replied. "Some very peculiar types undoubtedly existed among the Egyptians. I dare say they had their sideshows and circuses with the odd assortment of freaks that usually goes with such things. This poor fellow may have been a king's jester. It is really unfair to reproach him with his ugliness after all these years. I am sure his life was a very unhappy one." The professor's scowl grew in volume. "You must be serious," he retorted. "This mummy is very unusual. I am not a sensationalist, my dear boy, but I may say that my enemies would give a great deal to use this thing to discredit me. We must be very wary about publishing the results of our experiments." "Experiments?" I snatched at the word. I had a boyish and ridiculous eagerness for all varieties of research. "I have some experiments in mind that will demand a great deal of courage. If you do not feel equal to them, I shall want you to tell me so quite frankly. But first I must warn and prepare you and describe what we have to deal with." The professor lit an absurdly long panetella and puffed for several moments in silence. The smoke ascended spirally and formed a curious greyish nimbus above the mummy case. The mummy stood out in the depressing gloom like a sinister avenger of the 83 defenseless wretches that Professor Dewey had dissected and destroyed. When my friend spoke again, his voice had acquired a small measure of calm. He spoke slowly, punctuating his sentences with an occasional cough. There are few myths in the treasure house of mankind that were not originally based upon solid, objective facts. I do not believe that the imagination of primitive peoples is capable of creating bogies out of thin air. We are too easily deluded by modern science and altogether too apt to scoff at the legends of gods and goddesses that have come down to us. It is absurd to believe that the Egyptians created their monstrous bestial gods from mere observation of living animals. There is something so immense, so psychically terrible about the Egyptian gods that it is difficult to believe them simply the product of normal human imagination. They are either the imaginings of some dreamer of wild and unheard-of powers, an Edgar Poe among the Egyptians, or, Professor Dewey paused without stating his alternative. I presume he wanted his heresy to sink in, for he waited several moments before continuing, "These crocodile gods, these cat-headed and bat-eared divinities are really more debased than anything to be found anywhere in the modern world. Even your barbarous blackfellow in Africa or Australia would be incapable of worshipping anything so vile. And yet, if we are to believe historians, the Egyptians had a high degree of ethical culture. They would not fashion such horrors willingly. I have often thought," again my friend hesitated, as if ashamed to put his theory into words. My eagerness apparently reassured him. "I have often thought that these monsters really existed. Why should we suppose that men are the only intelligent beings on this planet? There is so much evidence to the contrary, so very much evidence, that I feel justified in my theory. I do not think that I am a fool. My enemies, I fear my friends suffered from a persecution complex, would give years of their lives to overhear this conversation. But they shall only hear of the results, if the results are not too revolting." Professor Dewey sank down on a chair as if exhausted. Beads of sweat stood out horribly on his high yellow forehead. His lips quivered. "George," he stammered, "we must put it to the test. We must sleep here tonight. Unless, of course, you fear to sleep in the room with that." "But what is that, really?" I asked, pointing with horror to the colossal mummy. My friend did not answer me directly, but his words were dreadfully disturbing. 20 or 30,000 years ago, the Egyptians buried their first kings. There were strange kings in the dawn world. Chapter 2. Professor Dewey was sleeping soundly, but something made me sit up. I am not sure whether I dreamed a sound, or whether a sound had actually come from the corner of the room where the great mummy stood solemnly in its 50 wrappings. But whether the dismal noise had any basis in fact, it was a profoundly disturbing thing to hear at 3 o'clock in the morning. Perhaps you have listened to hounds baying at night across lonely moors, or perhaps you have heard in the tropics the horrid moans of small monkeys when they awake from their mindless sleep and see the stars watching them, evilly. If you have heard such sounds, you may have a remote idea of how vile these audibly sinister exhibitions of evil and fright seem to a normally constituted man. The low whining that I heard, and it occasionally seemed to rise to an actual baying, did not frighten me. But had the chair that loomed unpleasantly before me out of the gloom suddenly entered into conversation with the sofa, or had the clock walked across the mantel, I should not have been more horrified. I sat up and waited. For several moments nothing happened, but then I heard a low scratching and scraping, as if something were trying to get out of the closet. Claws of some sort were indubitably at work somewhere. Rats, I reflected, and I clung to the suggestion warmly. Of course there would be rats in a house given over to unhallowed and unsavory practices. The professor is fortunate to have rats to do the really dirty work, I mused. They save him the bother of burning the odds and ends. It must be damnably difficult to get rid of fingernails and hair and such things, unless one burns them, and of course the rats would save him that task. The professor is really very fortunate. Dear jolly rats. Then I realized the fatuousness of my reflections and passed my hand rapidly back and forth across my face. My forehead was infernally warm. I was excited, feverish. It's probably a touch of influenza, I thought. I should never have slept in this old room. I recalled that I had been sneezing and coughing most of the previous afternoon. The slightest touch of fever makes me delirious. In that respect, I am abnormally favored. I pulled the blankets about my neck and turned over. I think then that I slept, but I am convinced that what I saw later had some external significance. The thing was more than a mere dream and certainly more than a hallucination. It was, I think, an actual body of memories projected across the room. When I saw it, I was sitting up and I heard the clock outside strike 4. A white immensity spread before me, and for a moment its whiteness blinded me. It was like a series of projections on the silver screen. The white substance was continually changing, now thinning, now thickening, and horrid, distorted forms moved about in it. The forms were amorphous, and I could not at first distinguish them clearly. They were not altogether human. They seemed to have the bodies of men, but the heads of animals. When the vision, or call it what you will, became clearer, I saw that the unmentionable creatures had formed into a solid phalanx, and that they were marching solemnly before me. They carried between them some unspeakable object, which they made no effort to conceal. If the forms of the marchers were revolting, the form of the long, distorted thing that they carried was infernal. It was covered with hair, but I never had seen anything like it under the stars. It had a sunken bat-like face and great, dog-shaped ears, and its yellow teeth glittered ominously in the strange, unnatural light. The thing was obviously lifeless, and its cheeks were sunken and hollow. The watchers carried torches which they waved exultantly, as if almost glad that the thing had died. I had a curious sympathy for these others, but heaven knows they were vile enough. The torches gave off a weird blue light and even, I thought, a mephitic smell. And as I watched, new ones were lit, and the swaying, blasphemous procession moved forward more rapidly. And then the chanting and intoning commenced, and the dreadful hymns for the dead swelled and reverberated in the room, until I put my hands before my ears to shut out the ancient and obscene chants. "Our master out of the skies is dead," they wailed. "Deep, deep in the earth shall we bury our king. Long has he ruled us, and horrible the evil he did to us. But he was our king out of the skies, and we revere his memory. Horrible his black tongue that shot out fire, horrible the maidens he devoured, horrible the blood he drank. But he was a king. In the book of the dead it is written that he shall be judged by gods. By his peers he shall be judged. He shall appear as a snake, as a reptile before his peers, but by his ears they shall know him." Then the picture cleared terribly, and I saw that the procession trod hot reddish sands, and a great stone effigy loomed up behind them. It was a sphinx, but a more ancient sphinx than the one we know, and its eyes glowed banefully. And in a deep and perfectly round hole dug in the sand at the statue's base they buried their king, and strewed gold dust upon him, and anointed his limbs with oil which they poured from jars of veined porphyry. Unmentionable were the rites they performed above him, and the last words of their loathsome high priest, who had the head of a lizard, were lethal words, and I shivered when I realized at whom they were directed. "For 30 centuries you shall sleep, but a little shameless creature with no hair to cover him shall drag you forth, because in his time he shall be as a god. But his evil day will not be long under the sun. He too shall return unto dust, and a very thin creature with neither legs nor eyes shall play havoc with his bones. It is written, 'Rest in peace, and remember us who worshipped you.'" The vision grew vaguer, and the forms seemed to converge and merge into each other. Then gradually the darkness closed in, and I found myself staring with frightened eyes at Professor Dewey's monstrous acquisition. It loomed vaguely out of the blackness, and it seemed to be stirring and squirming about. I watched fascinated while the ancient wrappings fell away, and 2 long pink hands fumbled hectically with mildewed cerements. The hands were abnormally emaciated and covered with thin reddish hair. I endeavored to rise, but the eyes of the thing watched me evilly and ordered me to be silent. It seemed angry that I should question its spiritual supremacy. It had uncovered its eyes, but the great loathsome nose remained mercifully concealed by several layers of disintegrating wrappings. It was frightful to watch the thing's efforts to free itself. It wriggled and squirmed, and in its vileness, it resembled a great fleshy worm endeavoring to escape from some deep sewer of earth. What followed will always remain confused in my memory. I seemed to recall Professor Dewey upon his back with closed eyes, and something standing above him in the dim light, like an immemorial avenger. I seemed to glimpse a supremely ghastly exterior, 2 great ears protruding from a narrow and greenish skull, and a great nose like an elephant's trunk showing briefly in profile. Then fire, a deluge of colored fire, which shot out of the creature's nose and mouth, fire from hell, fire from beyond Arcturus. I saw the professor's eyes open, and I saw him stare at the thing for a moment in triumph. The exultation in his face was quickly replaced by agony and despair. He threw out his arms as if endeavoring to ward off an immediate doom, and while I watched, his face shriveled and blackened. "I was right," he shrieked. "The Egyptians did not worship men. God pity my poor soul." I did not stay to comfort my stricken friend. I ran shrieking from the room and out of the house into the street. I looked up to see thick black smoke pouring from an upper window, but I turned in no alarm. I ran wildly across deserted squares and through winding alleys, and finally found my way to a leering subway entrance. I fled insanely down the stairs and climbed over the turnstile without depositing a fare. Luckily, no one saw me. In a moment I was in a roaring train, my arms flung about a drunken beggar, and into his astonished ears I poured a tale that made him gasp and shake his head. "You young uns allus get it somewhere," he grimaced. "I wish I had your luck." I have always found newspaper men exceedingly prosaic. The following cutting from a New York paper demonstrates my point. A fire in the Upper West Side caused a great deal of disturbance yesterday morning, when police reserves from 3 stations fought with firemen to keep excited passers-by from entering the burning building. For 2 hours, 30 or 40 hooded men endeavored to rescue the inmates and caused a great deal of disturbance. The police were unable to explain why utter strangers should take such an interest in one poor, perishing wretch, since it was later ascertained that the house was occupied by an eccentric professor and misanthrope who is suspected of bootlegging operations. Patrolman Henley from the West 93rd Street station claims that one of the would-be rescuers removed his hood for a brief moment and that his face was covered with fur and eaten away at the corners. Luckily for Patrolman Henley's reputation, he is known to suffer from migraine, and it is probable that what he imagined he saw had no basis in fact. The wildly excited attempts of strangers to enter the building completely frustrated operations, and the unfortunate inmate perished. For a moment, he was seen at the window, and those who were standing on the sidewalk immediately underneath declare that his hair and beard were actually on fire. The upper portion of the building was completely destroyed. A number of curious bones were found in the room, including the skeleton of a gigantic dog. During the past week, 3 previous fires have been reported in the neighborhood, and the police are investigating rumors of a firebug. End of the Dog, Eared God by Frank Belknap Long. The Man Who Died Twice by Frank Belknap Long. 1927. The ghost of a husband approaches his wife and her new man. When Hazlitt saw the stranger at his desk, his emotions were distinctly unpleasant. Upshur might have given me notice, he thought. He wouldn't have been so high-handed a few months ago. He gazed angrily about the office. No one seemed aware of his presence. The man who had taken his desk was dictating a letter, and the stenographer did not even raise her eyes. "It's damnable," said Hazlitt, and he spoke loud enough for the usurper to hear, but the latter continued to dictate. "The premium on policy 6284 has been so long overdue." Hazlitt stalked furiously across the office and stepped into a room blazing with light and clamorous with conversation. Upcher, the president, was in conference, but Hazlitt ignored the three directors who sat puffing contentedly on fat cigars and addressed himself directly to the man at the head of the table. "I've worked for you for 20 years, he shouted furiously, "and you needn't think you can dish me now. I've helped make this company. If necessary, I shall take legal steps." Mr. Upcher was stout and stern. His narrow skull and small eyes under heavy eyebrows suggested a very primitive type. He had stopped talking and was staring directly at Hazlitt. His gaze was icily indifferent, stony, remote. His calm was so unexpected that it frightened Hazlitt. The directors seemed perplexed. Two of them had stopped smoking, and the third was passing his hand rapidly back and forth across his forehead. "I frightened them," thought Hazlitt. "They know the old man owes everything to me. I mustn't appear too submissive. You can't dispose of me like this," he continued dogmatically. "I've never complained of the miserable salary you gave me, but you can't throw me into the street without notice." The president colored slightly. "Our business is very important," he began. Hazlitt cut him short with a wave of his hand. "My business is the only thing that matters now. I want you to know that I won't stand for your ruthless tactics. When a man has slaved as I have for 20 years, he deserves some consideration. I'm merely asking for justice. In heaven's name, why don't you say something? Do you want me to do all of the talking?" Mr. Upcher wiped away with his coat sleeve the small beads of sweat that had accumulated above his collar. His gaze remained curiously impersonal, and when Hazlitt swore at him, he wet his lips and began, "Our business is very important." Hazlitt trembled at the repetition of the man's unctuous remark. He found himself reluctant to say more, but his anger continued to mount. He advanced threateningly to the head of the table and glared into the impassive eyes of his former employer. Finally he broke out, "You're a damn scoundrel." One of the directors coughed. A sickly grin spread itself across Mr. Upcher's stolid countenance. "Our business, as I was saying," Hazlitt raised his fist and struck the president of the Rich Bank Life Insurance Company squarely upon the jaw. It was an intolerably ridiculous thing to do, but Hazlitt was no longer capable of verbal persuasion, and he had decided that nothing less than a blow would be adequate. The grin disappeared from Mr. Upcher's face. He raised his right hand and passed it rapidly over his chin. A flash of anger appeared for a moment in his small, deep-set eyes. "Something I don't understand," he murmured. "It hurt like the devil. I don't know precisely what it means." "Don't you?" shouted Hazlitt. "You're lucky to get off with that. I've a good mind to hit you again." But he was frightened at his own violence, and he was unable to understand why the directors had not seized him. They seemed utterly unaware of anything out of the ordinary, and even Mr. Upcher did not seem greatly upset. He continued to rub his chin, but the old indifference had crept back into his eyes. "Our business is very important," he began. Hazlitt broke down and wept. He leaned against the wall while great sobs convulsed his body. Anger and abuse he could have faced, but Mr. Upcher's stony indifference robbed him of manhood. It was impossible to argue with a man who refused to be insulted. Hazlitt had reached the end of his rope. He was decisively beaten. But even his acknowledgement of defeat passed unnoticed. The directors were discussing policies and premiums and first mortgages, and Mr. Upcher advanced a few commonplace opinions while his right hand continued to caress his chin. "Policies that have been carried for more than 50 years, he was saying, are not subject to the new law. It is possible by the contemplated." Hazlitt did not wait for him to finish. Sobbing hysterically, he passed into the outer office, and several minutes later he was descending in the elevator to the street. All moral courage had left him. He felt like a man who has returned from the grave. He was white to the lips, and when he stopped for a moment in the vestibule, he was horrified at the way an old woman poked at him with her umbrella and actually pushed him aside. The glitter and chaos of Broadway at dusk did not soothe him. He walked despondently, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes upon the ground. "I'll never get another job," he thought. I'm a nervous wreck, and old Upshur will never recommend me. I don't know how I'll break the news to Helen." The thought of his wife appalled him. He knew that she would despise him. "She'll think I'm a jellyfish," he groaned. "But I did all a man could. You can't buck up against a stone wall. I can see that old Upshur had it in for me from the start. I hope he chokes." He crossed the street at 73rd Street and started leisurely westward. It was growing dark, and he stopped for a moment to look at his watch. His hands trembled, and the timepiece almost fell to the sidewalk. With an oath, he replaced it in his vest. "Dinner will be cold," he muttered. "And Helen won't be in a pleasant mood. How on earth am I going to break the news to her?" When he reached his apartment, he was shivering. He sustained himself by tugging at the ends of his mustache and whistling apologetically. He was overcome with shame and fear, but something urged him not to put off ringing the bell. He pressed the buzzer firmly, but no reassuring click answered him. Yet suddenly he found himself in his own apartment. "I certainly got in," he mumbled in an immeasurably frightened voice. "But I apparently didn't come through the door. Or did I? I don't think I'm quite well." He hung up his hat and umbrella and walked into the sitting room. His wife was perched on the arm of his Morris chair, and her back was turned towards him. She was in dressing gown and slippers, and her hair was down. She was whispering in a very low voice. "My dear, my darling, I hope you haven't worked too hard today. You must take care of your health for my sake. Poor Richard went off in 3 days with double pneumonia." Hazlitt stared. The woman on the chair was obviously not addressing him, and he thought for an instant that he had strayed into the wrong apartment and mistaken a stranger for his wife. But the familiar lines of her profile soon undeceived him, and he gasped. Then, in a blinding flash, he saw it all. His wife had betrayed him, and she was speaking to another man. A ghostly man stands behind a woman walking down the street. Hazlitt quickly made up his mind that he would kill his wife. He advanced ominously to where she sat and stared at her with furious, bloodshot eyes. She shivered and glanced about her nervously. The stranger in the chair rose and stood with his back to the fireplace. Hazlitt saw that he was tall and lean and handsome. He seemed happy and was smiling. Hazlitt clenched his fist and glared fiercely at this intruder into his private home. "Something has come between us," said Hazlitt's wife in a curiously distant voice. "I feel it like a physical presence. You will perhaps think me very silly." The stranger shook his head. "I feel it too," he said. "It's as if the ghost of an old love had come back to you. While you were sitting on the chair, I saw a change come over your face. I think you fear something." "I'll make you both fear something," shouted Hazlitt. He struck his wife on the face with his open hand. She colored slightly and continued to address the stranger. "It's as if he had come back. It is 6 months tonight since we buried him. He was a good husband, and I am not sure that I have reverenced his memory. Perhaps we were too hasty, Jack." Hazlitt suppressed an absurd desire to scream. The blood was pounding in his ears, and he gazed from his wife to the stranger with stark horror. His wife's voice sent a flood of dreadful memories welling through his consciousness. He saw again the hospital ward, where he had spent 3 days of terrible agony, gasping for breath and shrieking for water. A tall doctor with sallow, bloodless cheeks bent wearily above him and injected something into his arm. Then unconsciousness, a blessed oblivion, wiping out the world and all its disturbing sights and sounds. Later he opened his eyes and caught his wife in the act of poisoning him. He saw her standing above him with a spoon and a bottle in her hand, on which was a skull and crossbones. He endeavored to rise up, to cry out, but his voice failed him, and he could not move his limbs. He saw that his wife was possessed of a devil, and primitive horror fastened on his tired brain. He made dreadful grimaces and squirmed about under the sheets, but his wife was relentless. She bent and forced the spoon between his teeth. "I don't love you," she laughed shrilly, "and you're better dead. I only hope you won't return to haunt me." Hazlitt choked and fainted. He did not regain consciousness, but later he watched his body being prepared for burial, and amused himself by thinking that his wife would soon regret her vileness. "I shall show her what a ghost can do," he reflected grimly. "I shall pay her for this. She won't love me when I'm through with her." There had followed days of confusion. Hazlitt forgot that he was only a ghost, and he had walked into his old office and deliberately insulted Mr. Upcher. But now that his wife stood before him, memories came rushing back. He was a thin, emaciated ghost, but he could make himself felt. Nothing but vengeance remained to him, and he did not intend to forgive his wife. It was not in his nature to forgive. He would force a confession from her, and if necessary, he would choke the breath from her abominable body. He advanced and seized her by the throat. He was pressing with all his might upon the delicate white throat of his wife. He was pressing with lean, bony fingers. His victim seemed sunk into a kind of stupor. Her eyes were half shut, and she was leaning against the wall. The stranger watched her with growing horror. When she began to cough, he ran into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water. When he handed it to her, she drained it at a gulp. It seemed to restore her slightly. "I can't explain it," she murmured, "but I feel as if a band were encircling my throat. It is hot in here. Please open the windows." The stranger obeyed. It occurred to Hazlitt that the man really loved his wife. "Worse luck to him," he growled, and his ghostly voice cracked with emotion. The woman was choking and gasping now, and gradually he forced her to her knees. "Confess," he commanded. "Tell this fool how you get rid of your husbands. Warn him in advance, and he will thank you and clear out. If you love him, you won't want him to suffer." Hazlitt's wife made no sign that she had heard him. "You're doing no good at all by acting like this," he shouted. "If you don't tell him everything now, I'll kill you. I'll make you a ghost." The tall stranger turned pale. He could not see or hear Hazlitt, but it was obvious that he suspected the presence of more than two people in the room. He took Hazlitt's wife firmly by the wrists and endeavored to raise her. "In heaven's name, what ails you?" he asked fearfully. "You act as if someone were hurting you. Is there nothing that I can do?" There was something infinitely pathetic in the woman's helplessness. She was no longer able to speak, but her eyes cried out in pain. The stranger at length succeeded in aiding her. He got her to her feet, but Hazlitt refused to be discouraged. The stranger's opposition exasperated him, and he redoubled his efforts. But soon he realized that he could not choke her. He had expended all his strength, and still the woman breathed. A convulsion of baffled rage distorted his angular frame. He knew that he would be obliged to go away and leave the woman to her lover. A ghost is a futile thing at best and cannot work vengeance. Hazlitt groaned. The woman beneath his hands took courage. Her eyes sought those of the tall stranger. "It is going away. It is leaving me," she whimpered. "I can breathe more easily now. It is you who have given me courage, my darling." The stranger was bewildered and horrified. "I can't understand what's got into you," he murmured. "I don't see anything. You are becoming hysterical. Your nerves are all shattered to pieces." Hazlitt's wife shook her head, and colour returned to her cheeks. "It was awful, dearest. You cannot know how I suffered. You will perhaps think me insane, but I know he was back of it. Kiss me, darling. Help me to forget." She threw her arms about the stranger's neck and kissed him passionately upon the lips. Hazlitt covered his eyes with his hand and turned away with horror. Despair clutched at his heart. "A futile ghost," Lai groaned. "A futile, weak ghost. I couldn't punish a fly. Why in heaven's name am I earthbound?" He was near the window now, and suddenly he looked out. A night of stars attracted him. "I shall climb to heaven," he thought. "I shall go floating through the air and wander among the stars. I am decidedly out of place here." It was a tired ghost that climbed out of the window and started to propel itself through the air. But unfortunately, a man must overcome gravitation to climb to the stars, and Hazlitt did not ascend. He was still earthbound. He picked himself up and looked about him. Men and women were passing rapidly up and down the street, but no one had apparently seen him fall. I'm invisible, that's sure, he reflected. Neither Upshur, nor the directors, nor my wife saw me, but my wife felt me, and yet I'm not satisfied. I didn't accomplish what I set out to do. My wife is laughing up her sleeve at me now. My wife. She has probably married that ninny, and I hope she lives to regret it. She didn't even wait for the grass to cover my grave. I won't trust a woman again if I can help it. A woman walking on the street passed through him. Horrible! He groaned. There isn't anything to me at all. I'm worse than a jellyfish. An entire procession of men and women were now passing through his invisible body. He scarcely felt them, but a few succeeded in tickling him. One or two of the pedestrians apparently felt him. They shivered as if they had suddenly stepped into a cold shower. The streets are ghostly at night. Someone said at his left elbow, "I think it's safer to ride." Hazlitt determined to walk. He was miserable, but he had no desire to stand and mope. He started down the street. He was hatless, and his hair streamed in the wind. He was a defiant ghost, but a miserable sense of futility gripped him. He was an outcast. He did not know where he would spend the night. He had no plans and no one to confide in. He couldn't go to a hotel because he hadn't even the ghost of money in his pockets. And of course, no one could see him anyway. Suddenly, he saw a child standing in the very center of the street and apparently unaware of the screaming traffic about him. An automobile driven by a young woman was almost on top of the boy before Hazlitt made up his mind to act. He left the sidewalk in a bound and ran directly towards the automobile. He reached it a second before it touched the child, and with a great shove he sent the near victim sprawling into a zone of safety. But he could not save himself. The fender of the car struck him violently in the chest. He was thrown forward, and the rear wheels passed over his body. For a moment he suffered exquisite pain. A great weight pressed the breath from his thin body. He clenched his hands and closed his eyes. The pain of this second death astonished him. It seemed interminable. But at length consciousness left him. His pain dissolved in a healing oblivion. The child picked himself up and began to cry. "Someone pushed me," he moaned. "I was looking at the lights and someone pushed me from behind." The woman in the car was very pale. "I think I ran over someone," she said weakly. "I saw him for a moment when I tried to turn to the left. He was very thin and worn." She turned to those who had gathered near. "Where did you carry him to?" she asked. They shook their heads. "We didn't see anyone, madam. You nearly got the kid, though. Drivers like you should be hanged." A policeman roughly elbowed his way through the crowd that was fast gathering. "What's all this about?" he asked. "Is anyone run over?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know. I think I ran over a tramp." A poor, thin man he was. The look in his eyes was terrible, and very beautiful. I saw him for a moment just before the car struck him. I think he wanted to die." She turned again to the crowd. "Which of you carried him away?" she asked tremulously. "She's batty," said the policeman. "Get out of here, you!" He advanced on the crowd and began dispersing them with his club. The woman in the car leaned over and looked at the sidewalk, a puzzled, mystified expression on her pale features. "No blood or anything," she moaned. "I can't understand it." End of The Man Who Died Twice by Frank Belknap Long. Darkness Awaits by Frank Belknap Long. 1921. Chapter 1. Peter bent down and examined the frog. It was dead. It was lying among the pebbles at the edge of the stream, and her long paws were sadly waving in the muddy water. "Well, who would think of hurting such a tiny thing?" he muttered. "Oh, poor froggy," the boy added, almost crying. Peter had recently turned 18, but some of 10-year-olds had a reputation for being much more perceptive than he was. But even he understood that the frog had been strangled cruelly and hideously. Trembling, Peter poked a finger at the tight, shiny wire tied around the amphibian's neck. The cold frog flesh sent an unpleasant shiver from the fingertips to the wrist, and from there even higher, almost to the elbow. "Who would think of hurting this poor little animal?" Peter repeated, puzzled and deeply amazed. He didn't want to linger any longer and look further at the sad little corpse. The darkness was hurriedly creeping up, and Peter was so afraid of the rapidly lengthening shadows and branches, black and thin, crossed over his head like the fingers of a skeleton. Unfortunately, the local woods did not differ in cordiality and hospitality, especially at dusk. It was always gloomy and scary here. There were always some voices, a great many of them. When Peter returned home, his mother was already setting the table for dinner, and his stepfather was sitting by the window with an expired newspaper on his lap and a pipe between rotten, crumbling teeth. Peter closed the door and timidly entered the room. "Howdy there," his stepfather said indifferently. "Where have you been, lil cowboy?" "I was fishing in the river," Peter replied nervously. "I was hoping that the trout would take the bait and I could catch it. That's where I was, fishing. I haven't gone to any other place, honestly. Only by the river, and I sat there all the time, not a step away. I thought I'd catch a trout." His stepfather frowned. He was a tall, thin, middle-aged man with dark eyes and a pair of perpetually displeased creases at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, kid," he said. "Didn't I tell you not to go into the woods? Were you deaf?" "But I didn't do anything wrong," Peter muttered. "I was just fishing on the river. I was hoping to catch a trout. I didn't go there for anything else." "Yes, it's your 'didn't go there' written all over your face. I don't want to see you in the woods anymore. If I find out that you're hanging around there again, I'll give you such a beating. You'll remember it all your life." "Hush, Henry, hush," Peter's mother muttered from the kitchen. At dinner, Peter was silent and lamented. As soon as he finished the last bite, he apologized awkwardly and retired to his room. The kid was very scared. In his sensitive and uneducated brain, his stepfather's cruel humor had a certain connection with the sensations awakened in him by the forest and the quiet, dark waters of the river, almost inky in those moments when the sun did not touch them. When Henry threatened to do a beating, he wanted to run away from home, not out of fear of physical pain. It was just that Peter was becoming more and more afraid of something hidden behind the cruel, wrinkled face of the old man. "You can't behave like that with a boy," Peter's mother said meanwhile, picking up the plates from the table and piling them into the sink. "You're just scaring him, and he's a good one. He really doesn't do anything wrong." "Is that so?" Henry said bitterly. "Then why doesn't he obey? Why does he go to the forest? Why hang around where these creatures are hiding and watching everything? Maybe he talked to them. Considering that he's your son, that's not out of the question. He's dumb as a cork, Mary, and you better keep an eye on him. You never know what comes into his head." Peter's mother sighed. "He just went there to have a little fun." "Fun, you say? You know, Mary, I can deal with the creatures they've set against us, but the law won't let me knock a hair off your son's empty head. If they turn him against us, there's nothing I can do. He's your child after all, not mine. If it happens like I said, we'll have to get out of here in a hurry." "How do you like that, dear?" Peter's mother dabbed at her dry, cracked lips with the tip of her tongue. "Have you done something cruel again, Henry?" Peter's stepfather got up from the table and kicked a chair against the wall. "You shouldn't care about that," he exclaimed. "I have to defend myself somehow, must I? If the crops dry up, if the cows don't give milk, I'll have to fight for the right to survive in this damn world," he grunted, clearing his throat. "Those damn frogs are part of the problem too. They also incited them against us. You're not going to argue with me now, at least about the fact that at night their serenades became naturally unbearable. And what's left for us is to lie in bed awake, listen. Well, I'm done with them. We won't hear them croak anymore tonight." Mary turned pale. She put down the dishes and stood in front of her husband. "The frogs were our friends," she whispered. "I believed you. I prayed that you wouldn't hurt them. You said you would, but I was hoping. And what's the point of you waiting and praying when there's an enemy fighting against us that's purer than the devil himself? When God created the devil, Mary, he did a damn good job. But these creatures, they're complete darkness from the very beginning. To me, they weren't even included in the plan of creation. The very fact of their presence is some kind of mistake." "The frogs were our friends," Mary insisted desperately. "Yesterday when I was walking in the forest, I was warned." One of the shadow hunters was sitting in a tree and watching me. If it weren't for the frogs, he would have jumped right on my back. I saw his cruel, furious eyes looking straight at me through the leaves, but the frogs began to croak loudly. They brought me out of my stupor, so I turned around and ran away. They're getting more and more cocky, Henry. They know that Jim's father is not coming back, and they want to capture us. I guess I'll have to go to them whenever they want. And I'm going to have to take Jim's father's place. I'm not of their blood, but by marrying him, I've become part of the family, and I have a burden on me too. What about me, gal? Henry snorted. Do you think I haven't considered what would happen to me if we stopped fighting back? When I took you as my wife, I understood that I would take on everything, both good and bad, and sorrow, and joy. Well, we have a dark times right now, to be honest, but if you stand behind me like a wall, then I will respond in kind. Don't argue. When you told me about your late husband and the affairs of his family, who had unearthed something bad in the forest, I said I don't care. I see that you will be a good wife to me. But when I said that, I didn't know everything. I had no idea what it would be like for us. I didn't realize that they would turn all the forest animals against us, like a damn army. They didn't send frogs against us, Henry. Frogs love us. They are messengers. Well, is it even possible to believe in such nonsense? These croaking parasites are not on our side either. It was like that from the very beginning. I can't believe it's different now. Henry smiled sadly at that. Yes, I have fulfilled my threat. I strangled them all to death. I cut a good mile of wire into knots for their filthy green necks. I've been working all day, and now, you see, the job is done. There's not a single one left in the woods. Mary sank into a chair by the window and rested her flabby cheeks on her hands with a pained look. You did something bad and cruel, she muttered. It won't end well. The frogs were our friends, the only ones. We don't have any others anymore. They set them on us, Mary. They depleted the harvest, prevented chickens from laying eggs and cows from giving milk. I'm glad I got rid of them. Let 'em understand someone, but I will not sit idly by. You're going to regret this, Henry. The frogs were our friends. They tried to protect us, and you killed them. Do you think you can get away with this? Peter and I have been waiting for a long time, and they've been waiting for you. It won't take them long to show up and pick us all up. As long as we had frogs warning us, there was still hope, and now there is nothing to hope for. We don't even have friends in the woods anymore. Those things will get us, Henry. They'll take us under their stone circle, and there's nothing we can do. You should know how happy I was when I realized that the frogs were warning us. Yes, in terms of defending the house, of course they are of no use and they are noisy, but they were for us, little green things. Now everyone knows that Jim's father will not return to his grave. They will no longer honor their agreement with him. But there was still some hope with the frogs. It was as if they prevented any arbitrariness of the shadow workers. I felt so good with them around. Henry pursed his lips stubbornly and waved his hand at her tirade, which turned into a somnambulistic old woman's mumble. Chapter 2. Peter woke up after midnight. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and looked around dazedly. Something was knocking on the window pane. Peter didn't want to get out of bed. The night was cold, and he felt warm and cozy under the thick blankets. But something outside persistently and monotonously tried to attract his attention by hammering on the glass. Tap, 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 tap. Slowly and reluctantly, Peter pulled back the veil and jumped down to the floor. I'm coming, he replied. I'll open the window. I'll do whatever you want. Yes, I'll open it very soon. He padded barefoot across the floor, trembling. His heart was pounding wildly, and a pall of belated fear clouded his eyes. However, when Peter went to the window, he realized that no one was looking at him from that side, except for the bulging, blind silver eye of the moon. Still not fully shaking off the remnants of sleep, the boy felt like a beetle crawling through slowly solidifying amber, slow, clumsy, too big for this viscous, enveloping environment. His fingers reached for the latch on their own. The door creaked open. The wind blew over his frightened, thoughtless face, ruffling his unruly red hair. At any other time, Peter would have been afraid of the consequences of such a reckless act, but he was now under the influence, driven by the most sincere curiosity, that he acted instinctively without thinking. Then, for a minute or two, he peered into the wavering darkness outside the window and sniffed the fumes coming from the ground. Then, shaking his head, Peter walked unsteadily back to the bed. "There's no one there," he muttered. "I thought that someone would be there, but I must have been mistaken." Making a vague gesture with his hand, the boy climbed into bed. "I was afraid that someone from the forest might be there," he added, pulling the blanket up to his cheeks. "Someone alive, like those things I saw on my 8th birthday." For a few moments he stared at the ceiling. His brain, undeveloped to the brim, firmly stuck in the swamp of childhood, was full of images, memories, vague impressions from a sad, cloudy past. "It's inconvenient to ask where my grandfather lies," he said. "It's better not to ask where Grandpa went when it all started. I wasn't there, but I heard my mother say that it was terrible, and that Grandfather, no matter what, was a very bad person, and she made a contract with him to shoo him back. Once, many years ago, when Peter was 8 years old, he saw his grandfather talking to someone very conventionally humanoid. It was dark in the room, and the boy could not see the mysterious guest well. He was standing in the corner, near the fireplace, and his grandfather was talking to that thing. The guest was not as tall as Grandfather, and hunched over as if he had a heavy weight on his back. Peter couldn't really see his face, couldn't even guess where that face should be on his head, which resembled an obtuse triangle turned upside down. The guest smelled bad, but somehow in a special bad way, not like rotten meat or garbage, and Peter felt a little sick. He could have overcome the nausea, but the fear of the triangular head did not, which is why he hurried back to his room. When he told his mother about what he saw, she almost fainted. She said, "See, that's what I was afraid of. Your father talked to them too. Oh, why did I only marry him?" She bent down and kissed the top of her son's head. "My poor baby. If you see them too, they'll come to you someday." "Who was that, Mom?" little Peter asked. "Tell me, please." "You'll understand when you get older," she replied vaguely. "In the meantime, you don't need to know that." Peter hadn't seen anything like it for a long time, but before long his grandfather told him, "They also want to live in peace. They arrived here a long time ago, from very distant lands, and all they need is for no one to touch them." But I shook them up. "They have such knowledge as how to bury a person in the ground, but so that he does not die, but is transported to where they come from, or even further, to such fantastic places that it takes your breath away. But such a life always changes for the life of either one of the shadow men or one of the normal people. Their leader himself told me so. He said that if I helped them and got everyone away from the forest, he would take me where I needed to go, but only for a short time. But I'll outsmart him. I will stay there as long as I need to, and no less, and let them figure out how to arrange it themselves. Let them figure out for themselves at whose expense I will stay far away from this old world." It seems that the big problem was that Grandpa left one day and did not return. He never kept his promise to both sides. Yes, the strange creatures in the forest wanted to live in peace, but now they could not, and they had to patiently wait for Grandpa's return. And he went somewhere far away, as it seems, to those very distant lands. He was wandering, and it seemed that he was not going to return as long as he could. All this time, his shadowy companions guarded his burial on the hill, and waited. For a very long time, to such an extent that it slowly began to piss them off. Peter remembered his mother saying that the shadow hunters would come to him someday. Very vaguely, he understood that sooner or later they would come for him. Maybe that's why his stepfather forbade him to go into the woods. Maybe that's why he sometimes felt unaccountably scared in the woods. Apparently, when someone entered into some kind of agreement with the shadow hunters and spat on the terms, they came and took someone from their relatives when they got tired of waiting. At first, of course, they only hinted, somehow invading the way of things and making the land barren, cattle sluggish and infertile, forest animals aggressive. That was all Peter understood about them. He also understood that his mother knew that his grandpa would not return. And who would want to? If for the sake of those lands where he went, He was ready to lay down his life and lie down under a hill smelling of salt and rain, overgrown with green grass, under a stone circle. Then something truly fascinating and valuable was waiting for him there. Something that, no matter how hard you try, you can't find here. And Peter didn't blame Grandpa at all for not rushing back. He understood that as soon as his grandfather returned, he would have to lie under the hill for real, in pitch darkness, decomposing and not wandering anywhere else. But if I had the opportunity to walk in interesting places for ages, the boy reasoned aloud, somewhere where something is always happening and where someone will love me, I would, of course, yes, I would not be in a hurry, because walking on green grass is much more pleasant than lying under the green grass and feeling the earth clog up your nose. Drowsiness was taking hold of Peter. For a few moments, the boy still struggled with her, but gradually his thoughts stopped spinning around the shadows of the past. Closing his eyes, he broke into a peaceful smile. His mind, cleansed of all images, turned back into a blank sheet, unblemished and therefore self-sufficient. He slept peacefully, cut off from the world, completely unaware that he was no longer alone in the room. Chapter 3. The creature that appeared outside the window stood for a moment, balancing uncertainly on the steel bar of the windowsill. Dew and some other strange liquid were flowing down it. It looked for a short time, made a strange croaking sound, and nimbly jumped to the ground. Another similar figure appeared out of the darkness. After that one, more and more of them. They scurried noiselessly across the yard of the house, gathering on the porch behind the barn by the overturned garden wheelbarrow, and froze, as if they were waiting for someone else. And this someone appeared. This new someone was much bigger than all the others. Tangles of black hair or fur fell from his disproportionate triangular skull. He was older than all of them, and more evil than all of them, darker and more ancient. After waiting for everyone else to pull closer, forming a circle, he tilted his head towards them. White teeth and 2 pairs of small eyes, like distant cold stars, flashed in the blackness. He hissed hollowly, a sound like a car tire had been punctured. And then, with unexpected speed and agility, the shadow hunters rushed to the house all at once. The uncertain dawn glided like a wounded creature along the paths, scattering scarlet flashes over the tall trees and sending wavering shadows over the deep, dark waters of the river. In Eaton Pond, a lily leaf turned into a giant stained hand, and a spotted salamander rushed into the water, pushing air bubbles in all directions and leaving behind a whirlwind of wonderful radiance. The lily leaf's hand shot out over the water. It was reflected in the sharp, inquisitive eyes of its inhabitants, on wet noses, in the prints of small feet scurrying everywhere. But it wasn't just the dawn that was scarlet. The neighbors of the Oglethorpe family gathered at a decent distance to watch the house burn. The flames crackled, rose, and cast wavering reflections on the Oglethorpe stable with its grey walls, on the manure heaps between the stable and the sheaf machine, on the well and the mouldy pump next to it, on buckets filled to the brim with browning autumn leaves. When firefighters arrived, the flames lit up the entire pastoral landscape. In general, it was immediately clear that there was not much to save, and most likely there were no people to rescue. But at dawn, the neighbors, busily snooping among the ruins, made a very curious discovery. The bodies of Peter and Mary were nowhere to be found. Henry, the boy's stepfather, was there, among the burned wood and sooty bricks. His long legs lied in a puddle of muddy water left over from the firefighters' work. Someone bent down and touched, with fiercely trembling finger, the shiny wire encircling the neck of the dead man. The still warm dead flesh sent an unpleasant shiver from the fingertips to the wrist, and from there, even higher, almost all the way to the elbow. He was strangled, one of the neighbors exclaimed. Before the flames got to him, he was already dead. But where are Peter and Mary? Their bodies couldn't have burned up completely. It's the strangest thing I can remember in these parts, Sheriff Simpson said, coming out of the tool shed. Did you find anything there? Commissioner Wilson asked. He stood on the tall wet grass and looked thoughtfully to the west, past the black ruins of the ill-fated house. Frogs, the sheriff replied. 24 of them. They are all strangled with copper wire, just like Oglethorpe was strangled. Only the wire around Oglethorpe's neck was 10 times stronger. What about those frogs? They're all there in the barn. Dead. Strangled. But the strangest thing is that they are lying next to a large ball of copper wire of the same type that Oglethorpe was strangled with. The commissioner shook his head. Did Mary kill him and go on the run, taking her son with her? She has always been a humble soul. Such a person won't fight the power, and her son is generally a fool, harmless as a fly. Seems like we have a vague case here. One of the neighbors saw the house on fire. Said that even before the firefighters arrived, a whole horde poured out of the door. They were, as he said, kind of like people, but not really, and they had 2 swaddled bags with them, one bigger, the other smaller. Well, the guy said it was dark. Maybe he got confused about something. It seemed to him that those shadow people had some kind of strangely shaped heads, and one was completely shaggy, overgrown, kind of beastly. Reminds me of old wives' tales, right? Something like that. The commissioner nodded in displeasure. But come on, said that witness. That last one, the shaggy one, carried a torch, the one they burned down the house with. This work is in the public domain in the United States because it was published before January 1, 1929. The longest living author of this work died in 1994, so this work is in the public domain in countries and areas where the copyright term is the author's life, plus 29 years or less. This work may be in the public domain in countries and areas with longer native copyright terms that apply the rule of the shorter term to foreign works. End of Darkness Awaits by Frank Belknap Long.